It was a quiet September evening when I first arrived at the cabin, tucked away in the dense woods of upstate New York. The sun was just dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the unpaved road. I hadn't planned on staying for long, just a few days to get away from the pressures of work and the noise of city life. The idea of solitude had always appealed to me, but it was different when you're actually alone, away from everything familiar. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. A small, weathered structure built decades ago by my grandfather. It had been in our family for generations, mostly used in recent years. I spent some time there as a kid, but it had been a long while. Now, at 32, I needed a break. The hustle and bustle of my daily life had worn me thin, and the promise of some peace and quiet was just what I needed. The drive had taken longer than I expected, mostly due to the winding roads and overgrown trails that led up to the cabin. The GPS was useless out here, and I found myself relying more on old memories of the area to find my way. The forest seemed endless, with trees reaching up like twisted arms in the growing dusk. Every now and then, I would spot a small animal darting across the path, but other than that, it was eerily still. By the time I parked in front of the cabin, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving behind only the faintest trace of light. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way to the cabin's front door, which creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of old wood and dust. A faint, musty odor lingered in the corners, but nothing that would make me turn around and leave. Felt safe in a way. The inside of the cabin hadn't changed much since I was a kid. The same worn leather armchair sat by the stone fireplace, and the faded rug still lay on the creaky wooden floor. The kitchen had been minimally updated over the years, but the rest of the cabin remained frozen in time. I wasn't here for luxury. I was here to disconnect, to have nothing but silence for company. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth felt good against the chill of the evening, and as the flames crackled, I settled into the chair with a book. But soon enough, my thoughts began to wander, as they always did when I had too much time alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the cabin itself, no, it was the woods surrounding it. The way the trees seemed to move in the wind, bending and twisting, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. It wasn't normal. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered. I was alone out here, completely alone. There were no neighbors for miles, no one to rely on if something went wrong. I reminded myself that it was just my imagination running wild, fueled by years of horror movies and stories. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After a few hours, the fire had died down, and I turned off the lights, deciding to head to bed. The cabin's only bedroom was upstairs, and as I climbed the creaky stairs, I found myself scanning the darkness outside through the small window at the top. Nothing, just trees, and the occasional flicker of a distant animal moving in the underbrush. I settled into the bed, pulling the thick blanket up to my chin. The room was colder than I'd expected, and despite the warmth from the fireplace downstairs, I couldn't shake the chill that settled in my bones. I closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping, like a branch brushing against the window. It was subtle at first, almost like the wind was playing tricks, but then it came again, louder this time. I froze, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't see anything out the window. It was pitch black outside, but the sound persisted, and it was coming from the direction of the forest. My heart raced in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if something was genuinely off. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, and it was almost as if it were calling to me. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept over to the window. I peeked through the blinds but saw nothing. The woods were completely still. I looked up and down the street, but the path was empty, just the faint glow of the moon illuminating the trees. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just a wild animal or perhaps the wind. I climbed back into bed, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach, but the sound persisted, growing louder and closer. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was someone or something out there. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and carefully crept back to the window. I was about to shine the light out when I heard a voice, low and gravelly, but unmistakably human. It was distant at first, but it was there, like someone whispering from the edge of the woods. "Help!" The voice trailed off, and the tapping stopped. I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My first instinct was to call for help, but there was no one nearby, and the cell service was spotty at best. I couldn't risk going outside alone, not with whatever or whoever was out there. I decided to wait, hoping that the person, if it was a person, would leave. But the minutes dragged on, and the silence became unbearable. Then, just as I was about to give in to my fears and call the authorities, I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, dragging through the dirt. They were coming toward the cabin. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow and quick. What was happening? Was someone out there? And if so, why weren't they speaking anymore? The footsteps stopped just outside, but I couldn't see anyone. The darkness was too thick, and the beam of my flashlight barely pierced it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence. Finally, I gathered my courage and opened the window slightly. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room for much longer. There, in the distance, I saw a figure. It was vague, blurry at first, just a shadow against the trees. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see more clearly. It was a man, tall, hunched, wearing a tattered jacket. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see his eyes, wide and empty, staring directly at me. I felt my heart stop. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching me. I slammed the window shut and bolted the lock, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to hide, to stay as far away from that window as possible, but I was frozen. The man didn't move. He just stood there, like he was waiting for something. After what felt like forever, the footsteps slowly receded. I didn't dare look out the window again. I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I grabbed my bag, shoved some clothes into it, and headed downstairs. The cabin was dark and still. The fire had long since died out, leaving the place cold and empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was out there, waiting for me to make my move. I grabbed my car keys and stepped outside, not daring to look behind me. I walked quickly to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods around me were silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't care if I was making noise. I just needed to get away from that place. I started the car and drove down the gravel road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The figure from the woods was gone, but I couldn't shake the image of his eyes. It wasn't just the fear that stayed with me. It was the certainty that something wasn't right out there. I drove all the way back to the main road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The next morning, I returned to the cabin to gather my things. There were no signs of the man from the night before. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The cabin was as quiet as ever. But as I loaded my car, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise again, a nagging feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. I didn't know who or what had been out there in the woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. Some things are better left unexplored. And that cabin, with its dark, hidden corners and the memory of those eyes, would remain locked away in my past. I drove away without looking back, my heart finally starting to calm, but I knew the truth. I would never forget the man in the woods. The woods were silent as I trudged through the thick snow, the crunch of my boots the only sound to break the stillness. It had been a long drive from the city to this hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't entirely sure why I had agreed to this trip. Maybe it was the promise of getting away from the noise, the stress, or maybe it was just the need to disconnect for a while. Either way, I was here, and the cabin was more isolated than I'd realized when I booked it. The year was 2025, and I was 34 years old. My name's Jake, and I've always enjoyed hunting, even though I hadn't had the time to do it much in the past few years. The cabin I rented was owned by an older man named Frank who had made a living off hunting and guiding tourists through the area. The brochure had described it as a rustic, off-the-grid retreat with no distractions, which sounded perfect. I didn't want to be bothered by anyone or anything. I reached the cabin by late afternoon, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of red and purple. It was one of those rare, peaceful moments where you just feel the weight of everything fall away. As I pushed open the creaky door, a musty smell hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just the smell of an old, unused cabin, wood, dust, and that faint earthy scent that always seems to linger in places like this. The place was simple but charming, with a wood-burning stove in the corner, an old couch, a couple of chairs, and a kitchen that seemed more for show than actual use. There was no electricity, which I knew beforehand. Instead, there was a small gas-powered lamp that lit up the interior with a soft, flickering glow. A few supplies were left in the corner: firewood, canned food, bottled water, but everything else seemed sparse. Frank had mentioned there would be a generator, but I wasn't in the mood to deal with that. I wanted quiet. The first few hours of being there were perfect. I unpacked my gear and threw a few logs on the stove to heat up the cabin. The wind outside howled, but I was warm and comfortable inside. The snow had started to fall harder, making everything outside look like a winter wonderland. I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some canned beans and sausages. As I ate, I felt a sense of peace, something I hadn't felt in a while. The kind of peace that comes with being completely alone in nature, away from the buzz of modern life. After dinner, I sat on the couch, reading through a hunting magazine I had brought with me. I kept glancing at the window, watching the storm pick up, the snow swirling in the wind. There was something about being snowed in like this that made the world feel smaller, as though everything outside was a distant memory, far away from where I was now. It wasn't until the light outside faded completely that I began to feel the first twinges of unease. The cabin, though small, felt larger in the dark, and the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows. I stood up and went to check the door, just to make sure it was still securely locked. It wasn't out of fear, more like just a habit, something I did when I was alone. I pulled the door shut and locked it with a satisfying click. The place felt sealed off from everything now, safe and secure. But the longer I sat in that silence, the more something felt off. The storm outside seemed to press in on me. The sound of the wind became louder, and then I thought I heard something else, something different. A soft thud, like something heavy had dropped outside. I stood up quickly, straining to hear better. The wind was still howling, but I could have sworn I heard the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a rush of adrenaline flood through me. I wasn't entirely sure why, but my instincts told me that something wasn't right. I grabbed the rifle I'd brought with me, checking it quickly. There was no reason to assume that someone else was out there. It was just the kind of place that wouldn't get many visitors, especially in a storm like this. But my gut told me something was off, and I wasn't about to take chances. The footsteps seemed to stop. I waited for a long moment, every nerve in my body on edge. There was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the wind howling outside. I was about to turn around when I heard it again. A soft crunch of snow, closer this time. Whoever it was, they were coming toward the cabin. I quickly moved toward the window and peered outside, but the snowstorm had grown so intense that I could barely see more than a few feet in front of the cabin. The snow was falling so thick and fast that the world outside seemed to disappear. My breath fogged up the glass as I wiped it away, squinting through the swirling white. Nothing. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. Maybe it was an animal, perhaps a deer or something else in the woods. But then I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. A low thump, and then a scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. It was at that moment that I knew I wasn't alone. I moved silently to the back of the cabin, trying to keep out of view of the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another hunter? Someone else looking for shelter in the storm? Or was it something more sinister? My gut clenched as I thought about the possibility that someone was out there with bad intentions. This wasn't a place you'd stumble upon by accident, not in this weather. I waited for a while, crouched low, barely breathing. The noise outside continued, though it was muffled by the snowstorm. I heard a distant creak, like something heavy was being set down on the porch. My hands were slick with sweat now as I clutched the rifle, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The scraping sound grew louder, and then there was a knock on the door. It was brief but sharp, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew better than to open it. If it was someone I didn't know, I wasn't about to let them in. I remained motionless, listening for any further movement. The seconds felt like hours, but eventually, the noise outside stopped. I waited, tense, until my muscles burned from the strain of holding still. The cabin seemed to be holding its breath. I slowly made my way to the back door, unhooking the latch and sliding it open just a crack. The storm outside had intensified to the point where I could barely make out anything more than vague shadows through the swirling snow. It was quiet now, almost too quiet. I stepped out cautiously, my boots crunching softly in the snow. The wind lashed against my face as I peered into the darkness. There was nothing, no movement, no sounds. The footsteps had stopped, and the area around the cabin was deserted. But then my eyes caught something in the snow. Footprints. They weren't mine. They led toward the side of the cabin and stopped near a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. The tracks were fresh, new, made just moments ago. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever had been out there was close. I had no idea how they had gotten so near without me hearing them, but I couldn't risk them being right outside, watching. I backed into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The wind outside seemed to pick up again, as if mocking my paranoia. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my nerves. I couldn't let whatever was out there get to me. It was just one person, right? If I stayed calm, kept my head, I'd be fine. The night stretched on, the sounds of the storm outside growing louder, but I didn't hear anything more. Eventually, exhaustion started to settle in. I was still uneasy, but I knew I had to sleep, to rest and get through the night. With one last glance at the door, I made my way to the bed and collapsed under the heavy blankets. Sleep came in fits and starts, the storm outside like a constant reminder of how isolated I was. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump, but I managed to drift off eventually, too tired to stay alert. When I woke up, the storm had stopped. The sky was lightening, the first rays of the sun cutting through the clouds. The world outside was pristine, untouched, with the snow settled into smooth, silent drifts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but as I looked around the cabin, everything seemed normal. I opened the door and stepped outside, my boots sinking into the fresh snow. The footprints from the night before were gone, as if they had never been there at all. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. It was just me, the cabin, and the wide, empty wilderness. I wasn't sure what had happened that night, whether it had all been my imagination or whether someone had really been out there. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be staying another night in that cabin. I packed up my gear, locked the door behind me, and headed back to the truck. The quiet of the forest seemed to follow me all the way, and even though the storm had passed, the feeling of unease never really left. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin one last time, disappearing behind the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching, but I had made it through the night, and that was enough. It started when my uncle died. We weren't close, not really. He was one of those relatives I only saw on holidays, the kind that showed up smelling like motor oil and old sweat, always with a beer in hand. Still, when he passed, he left me his place up north, a small hunting cabin near a decommissioned cemetery just outside Ironwood, Michigan. Nobody wanted it. My dad offered it to me like he was trying to pass off an old, broken couch. I was 28, living paycheck to paycheck in Grand Rapids, working as a mechanic during the day and sleeping in my truck some nights. So when the offer came up, I said yes. I figured I could clean it up, maybe live in it for a while or fix it and flip it for cash. I didn't think much of the fact that the property bordered an old graveyard. The listing just called it disused county land with historic significance. I didn't even look at the photos before I packed my things. The drive up was quiet, mostly two-lane roads flanked by thick forests and the occasional half-collapsed barn. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting everything in a dull amber light. I pulled onto the narrow dirt path that split off the county road, overgrown and barely wide enough for my truck. The tires crunched against gravel and dead leaves. A couple of squirrels scattered from under a log as I passed. The cabin sat low on a slope, not far from the base of a ridge. The cemetery was right next to it, maybe 60 feet from the back of the house, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that had toppled in places. Some of the headstones were leaning or cracked, others sunken almost completely into the ground. It looked forgotten, but not in a spooky way, just old, like everything up there. The cabin was a single story, wood-paneled, with a sagging roof and a cinder block chimney that looked like it had survived 100 winters. The front porch was soft under my boots, and the door creaked like something out of a horror movie, but inside it was mostly intact. A dusty wood stove sat in the corner. A twin bed covered in a blue tarp was pushed against one wall. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a tiny bathroom that barely had room for a toilet and a sink. No shower, no hot water. I brought in my things: sleeping bag, a camp stove, a few cans of beans and tuna, a box of tools, and lit a few candles. The place smelled like dust and mildew, but it wasn't unlivable. That night, I laid in bed, staring at the wooden beams above, listening to the wind push through the trees. The cemetery was quiet. Everything was quiet. For the first few days, I kept busy. I patched a hole in the roof with some tar paper and nails I found in the shed, swept out the cobwebs, and cleaned out an old steel barrel of junk behind the house. I'd brought an old radio with me, but the only station I could pick up was a scratchy country channel. No cell service, either. I didn't mind. I liked the silence. On the 4th day, I walked through the graveyard. There were maybe 20 headstones, most of them from the early 1900s. A few were so eroded you could barely read them. One read Infant 1907 and nothing else. Another one had a last name, Went, but the first name had been chipped away. I stepped over a fallen piece of the fence and wandered a little deeper, past a section where the brush had grown tall and thick. Back there, hidden by saplings and brambles, I found something odd. It was a concrete slab, maybe 5 feet long, 3 feet wide. No name. No markings. It looked newer than the rest of the cemetery, cleaner, more precise. Around the edges, the grass was dead, like something had leached the soil. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just noted it and moved on. Probably someone added it later. Maybe a pet burial or a vandal's prank. That night, I heard something outside. It was past midnight. I'd been half asleep when I caught it. A soft, steady thudding. Not loud, just enough to prick my ears. I sat up. The wind had stopped.
No rain.
I got out of bed and crept to the window. The moon was bright enough to see by, and in the field between the cabin and the cemetery, I saw movement. A figure, not a ghost, not some glowing thing. Just a person walking slow, like they were looking for something. They were hunched, wearing a coat or maybe a blanket over their shoulders. They bent down, touched the ground, then stood up again. I stood there watching for maybe 5 minutes, heart thudding. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. I didn't say anything, just tried to see clearer. But when I moved off the porch, the figure was gone, vanished into the tree line like smoke. I walked all the way to the cemetery fence. Nothing, no sound, no footprints I could see. It was probably a hiker or a hunter, maybe a drunk. The next day, I found something strange near the graveyard. A fresh patch of dirt near that same concrete slab. The soil looked disturbed, darker, like it had been dug up and put back again. I walked around it, kneeling to look closer. There were boot prints, deep ones, heavy treads, probably size 11 or 12. Not mine. I checked around the rest of the cemetery but didn't find anything else out of place. That afternoon, I drove into Ironwood, bought some more food, a new lock for the cabin, and a couple of trail cams. I figured if someone was sneaking onto the property, I'd catch them. I set one up facing the cemetery and another near the back of the house. For a few days, nothing happened. I spent time cutting brush and splitting logs. I saw deer a few times, a fox. No sign of the stranger. But then, a week later, the trail cam by the cemetery caught something. It was a single photo, timestamped 2:43 a.m. A man crouching over the concrete slab. He wore a hood and gloves. His face wasn't visible. He had something in his hand, maybe a pry bar or a shovel handle. The next photo, taken 10 seconds later, was empty. I should have called the cops, but the property was mine now, and honestly, I didn't want them poking around. I decided I'd confront whoever it was myself. That night, I stayed up, sitting by the window with the lights off and a crowbar on my lap. Around 3 a.m., I saw him again. Same slow walk, same posture, moving through the cemetery like he knew exactly where he was going. I stepped outside. He didn't run, didn't even flinch. He just ducked out of sight behind a headstone, and by the time I got to the fence, he was gone again. The brush was still.
No footsteps.
No sound. In the morning, I went back to the slab. This time, I saw that it had been moved slightly. The corner was lifted just a hair, like someone had wedged something underneath. I found a stick jammed into the dirt nearby, snapped in half. Whatever was under there, someone wanted it. I decided I had to know. That night, I came back with a pry bar and a flashlight. Took me 30 minutes to work the slab loose. It was heavy, maybe 300 pounds, and under it was a pit, about 2 feet deep, lined with plastic sheeting. Inside was a metal box, rusted but sealed with bolts. I hauled it out, heart racing, and dragged it back to the cabin. Took me another hour to open it. Inside were plastic bags, tightly wrapped. When I cut the first one open, the smell hit me like a brick wall. Rot. Decay. I dropped the knife and backed up, gagging. I knew instantly what it was. The first bag held bones. Human bones. Not ancient ones either. The second bag held clothing, a red jacket stained and torn. The third bag I couldn't even finish opening. Inside was tissue, skin, hair, a piece of a face. I don't know how long I stood there staring. Couldn't believe it. Someone had buried a body under that graveyard slab. Maybe more than one. And whoever had been visiting at night, they weren't paying respects. They were checking on it, maintaining it. I wrapped the box in plastic and buried it behind the cabin. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I drove into town and used a payphone outside a gas station to call the state police. I gave them an anonymous tip, told them I'd seen someone digging in the old cemetery, said I was hiking nearby, didn't leave my name. I drove back to Grand Rapids that afternoon. 2 weeks later, I read about it in the paper. Human remains found near abandoned cemetery. Investigators were looking into several disappearances from the past 10 years. The article didn't say if they had suspects. I never went back to the cabin. I signed it over to the county and told them to bulldoze it. They did. I think about it sometimes. How many people must have walked through that graveyard and never known? How close I came to confronting someone capable of that. I still wonder who it was. That quiet figure in the night. What they were doing. Why they buried someone there. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe a local. Maybe my uncle knew, maybe not. I try not to dwell on it. I live in Muskegon now, near the lake. I keep to myself. I rent an apartment above a bait shop and work the docks. I don't talk about the cabin, but I still have the trail cam photo. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the world goes quiet, I look out the window and imagine someone walking slowly across the dark, just on the edge of sight, checking to see if their secret is still buried. It's not, and neither am I. It had been a long, exhausting week, and the decision to take a break seemed like a good one. My boss had been nagging me about getting out of the city for a while, and I figured a few days alone at my uncle's old cabin on the farm would be the perfect way to disconnect. I was in my late 30s, but something about being in a place like that always made me feel like I was a kid again, close to nature, close to something pure. I hadn't been there in years, not since my uncle had passed. But the place was still there, tucked away in the hills, surrounded by thick woods and fields that stretched on for miles. I had never really been afraid of the dark or the isolation. In fact, I preferred it. I enjoyed the quiet, the simplicity of just existing with nature. So, when I pulled up the dirt driveway leading to the cabin on that Friday evening in early fall, I felt nothing but relief. The familiar sights of the old farmhouse, the barn, and the surrounding trees settled a deep comfort into my chest. The cabin itself was a small structure made of weathered wood and stone, with a slanted roof and large windows that faced out over the fields. My uncle had built it himself, and though it had aged, it still stood strong. The place had a certain charm, one that reminded me of simpler times when the only thing that mattered was being outside, working the land, or just sitting around the fire at night. I parked the truck and grabbed my bag from the back seat. The sky was already darkening, the horizon painted with streaks of orange and purple. There was a cool breeze, and the smell of earth and pine filled the air. I headed inside and set down my things. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove in the corner, a couple of armchairs, and a thick wool rug on the floor. The kitchen was functional, with a stove, a sink, and an old wooden table. Everything about the cabin felt grounded, as if it was part of the earth itself. The first night went by peacefully enough. I made a simple dinner of soup and bread, then sat on the porch with a book, watching the last light of day disappear behind the hills. The air had cooled significantly by the time I decided to turn in. I made a fire in the stove and curled up in bed, listening to the sounds of the night. The occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant cry of an owl, the soft hoot of a bat soaring through the dark sky. But then it happened. It started as a strange sound, something like a shuffle or a scrape against the ground. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer wandering too close to the cabin. But the sound didn't go away. It came from just outside the window, followed by the faint creak of something heavy pressing against the wooden frame. My heart rate quickened. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, that scrape. This time it was more deliberate, more methodical. I waited, barely breathing. The wind had died down and everything was still. I glanced toward the window, which was partially open, allowing a cool breeze to drift inside. The shadows outside seemed unnaturally thick, like they were moving, but there was nothing to see. The sound came again, closer this time, and then there was the unmistakable sound of someone or something breathing, a low, drawn-out exhale like it was standing just outside, trying to stay hidden. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I felt that primal urge to run, to hide, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it. Could it be a person? Someone wandering out here in the woods? Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. The breath came again, louder this time, followed by the faintest sound of footsteps moving away from the window. I didn't wait to see if they would return. I grabbed my flashlight, silently crept toward the door, and peeked out through a crack in the wall. Nothing. The woods were silent again, but now there was a tension in the air, an unease that wasn't there before. I didn't know what had caused it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I spent the next hour staring out of the window, my hand gripped tightly on the flashlight, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe the wind had knocked something over, or maybe the house creaked in a way I hadn't remembered. Either way, the light of day did little to reassure me. The woods were calm and still, but a sense of discomfort lingered, like a warning I couldn't quite understand. I spent the next day walking around the farm, checking the barn, fixing some minor things that needed attention. But every time I returned to the cabin, that same feeling crept over me. It wasn't the wind or the usual creaks of the old structure. It was something else, something subtle but insistent. The night came again, and I tried to push my unease aside, telling myself that I was just tired. The sounds of the night returned, this time more familiar, more reassuring. But around midnight, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it again. The scrape, the shuffle, closer this time. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart thumping in my chest. The noise continued, getting nearer, until it seemed to stop right outside the door. Then, the breathing, slow, ragged, and deep, came again, followed by a series of soft, deliberate knocks against the doorframe. I had no choice. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed the rifle from where it was hanging above the mantel and quietly moved toward the door. My hands were shaking, but I steadied myself, remembering what my uncle had always taught me. Stay calm, stay focused, and be prepared for anything. Slowly, I cracked the door open, just enough to peer into the darkness. There was nothing, just the empty field, the tall grass swaying in the wind, and the trees looming like dark sentinels. I exhaled, feeling foolish for being so tense. But before I could pull the door shut, something caught my eye. A shape, barely visible in the shadows, standing by the edge of the woods. It was a person, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that blended into the night. They stood perfectly still, facing the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea who it was, or why they were standing there, motionless, in the middle of the night. But I couldn't take my eyes off them. And then, without warning, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there, holding the door open, unsure of what I had just seen. My mind raced. Was it someone from town? Maybe a local who had lost their way? Or something else? Something that didn't belong in the woods? The next morning, I decided to leave. I had had enough. I packed my things, double-checked the doors and windows, and started my truck. But as I drove down the dirt road toward the highway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure I had seen in the woods last night was standing at the edge of the road, watching me drive away. And this time I saw their face. It was a face I knew all too well. The same face that had been staring back at me in my uncle's old photographs. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I floored the gas pedal and kept driving, not daring to glance in the rearview mirror. The further I got, the more the tension in my chest eased. But the question lingered. Who or what had I seen in the woods that night? I never returned to that cabin, not after that. The farm was left to decay, and the place became a memory, a reminder of a time I would never forget, and a feeling that would never quite leave me. But the one thing I'm sure of now is that some things aren't meant to be revisited. And some things in the woods, some things in the dark, are better left undisturbed. It was October of 2018 when I took a week off work to head into the mountains of northern New Mexico. I was 37 at the time, single, living in Farmington, and tired of the same repetitive days of working maintenance at the hospital. I wanted to clear my head. I figured a week out in the woods, alone, with a small rented cabin and nothing but trees and wind, would do the trick. The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was about 35 minutes from the closest town, Dulce. I had found the listing on some forum for hunters. It was one of those side rental places not really on any big site. I had to mail a check to the guy and get the keys in the mail too. A small log cabin with a wood stove, no power, no signal, just a spring nearby and a fire pit out back. That was all I needed. I packed in food, water, a camp stove, and a few basic tools. I had my .308 Winchester with me too, mostly in case I saw an elk, but part of me just liked having it close. The road up was already rough and narrow. After I passed the last ranch gate, it turned to pure dirt, winding through dense pine and juniper. The trees closed in around the truck like a tunnel. The late afternoon sun flickered through branches like an old film reel, and dust kicked up behind me in a thick tail. I passed an old rusted sign nailed to a tree that just said, "Private." I got to the cabin just before sundown. It was tucked in a shallow ravine, shaded and quiet, surrounded by pine with a small dry creek bed maybe 15 yards to the west. There were deer tracks along the gravel drive and scratch marks on one of the fence posts. The air had that sharp alpine chill and smelled like sap and dry earth. The cabin had one small porch, a door with a rusted latch, and 2 shuttered windows. Inside was a cot, a wood-burning stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a small shelf with some old utensils. No insulation, no modern touches. I swept out a few cobwebs, unpacked my gear, and set up camp for the night. I had a lantern and a battery pack for my flashlight. My plan was simple: hunt in the morning, hike during the day, read at night, and sleep early. The first night was fine. I cooked some canned chili, read by lantern light, and sat outside until the cold pushed me back in. The wind moved through the trees in waves, and I could hear what sounded like elk far off in the hills. Coyote barked once, then silence. That kind of total silence that feels thick, like you could reach out and touch it. I slept pretty well. The cot creaked, and the fire burned low, but I was out fast and didn't wake up until sunrise. Day 2 was colder. I hiked west across the ridge, scouted game trails, and found a few piles of fresh scat. Around noon, I saw movement through the trees and froze. A shape darted between the trunks. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it moved wrong, too quick. I raised the rifle and scanned but saw nothing more. I chalked it up to a deer that had seen me before I saw it. That night, something felt off. It was around 11 p.m. I was in the cot, half asleep, when I heard a thump against the wall behind me. Not loud, just a single hit, like something bumped into it. I sat up, listened. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a pine cone, maybe a branch. I forced myself back down. 5 minutes later, another thump, this time lower, near the bottom of the wall. Then silence. I stayed frozen for at least an hour, listening. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside and checked. There was a scuff in the dirt by the wall, deep like a boot or hoof had pressed into the ground. But it was narrow, long, no print, just a mark. The side of the cabin had a faint smear, like dried mud. I brushed it off. I did another hike that day, less eager. Kept my rifle slung but ready. I moved slower and kept checking behind me. That night, the air felt wrong. Still, too still. Even the trees weren't swaying. Around 2 a.m., I woke up in the dark. The fire was dead, the lantern was off, and I was drenched in cold sweat. I didn't remember dreaming, but I had this crushing feeling in my chest, like something was in the room with me. I stayed perfectly still, my ears strained for sound. Then I heard it, light crunches in the dirt outside, deliberate, like something walking. One step, pause, another, closer, another, then breathing. It was right outside the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, clicked the light on. Nothing in the room. I crept to the window and cracked the shutter an inch. The beam caught movement, just barely. Something upright, tall, way taller than a man, and thin. It moved between the trees without sound. I killed the light and backed away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went out and found tracks. Long strides, almost like a person, but wrong. The heel and toe were off. Too long, too narrow. The gait wasn't human. I followed the tracks into the trees for about 30 yards. Then they vanished. No broken branches, no scent. Just gone. I packed a day bag and drove to the closest ranger station about an hour and a half away. I told them I saw something strange. A big animal, maybe a mountain lion. The guy behind the desk nodded like he heard that a lot. "There's stuff up there," he said, writing something on a pad. "Don't go walking alone at night." That was it. I almost left that day, but part of me felt stupid, like I was scaring myself over nothing. I told myself it was a large cat, maybe a malformed bear, something like that. I went back before dark. Night 4 was quiet until just after midnight. I was up reading when I heard footsteps on the porch. 2 steps, then a slow drag, then 2 more. I stood and turned off the lantern, moved to the side of the window and peeked through. There was something standing there, just at the edge of the porch, facing the door. My heart skipped. It was tall, at least 7 feet, naked or nearly naked. The skin looked wrong, pale and stretched like old leather. The legs were too thin, knees bent wrong. Its arms were long, and one of them twitched. Then it spoke, said my name, not shouted, not whispered, just said it, flat.
No emotion.
My full name, but no one knew I was up there. No one. I didn't respond. I didn't move. Stayed there still for what felt like forever. Then it backed away 1 step at a time. I never heard it leave. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I packed everything and loaded the truck. I was done. I didn't care how stupid I felt. I left before the sun was fully up, driving fast down the trail road. About 10 minutes down the hill, I came around a bend and slammed the brakes. In the road was a deer, or something that looked like a deer, but it was standing upright. It had the shape of a man, hunched with legs bent backward. The head was a deer's, but too big. Its eyes were too human. It turned slowly and stepped off the road into the trees. I kept going. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I got home, I told no one. Not really, just that I saw weird stuff. I didn't hunt for a while after that. A year, maybe more. But about 6 months later, I got a letter. No return address, just my name. Inside was a photo, black and white, old, looked like a print from the 1970s. A group of people standing in front of the same cabin. One of them looked just like me, or close, a little off, same eyes. On the back, it just said, "It remembers." I burned the letter and never went back. Whatever I saw up there, whatever thing it wasn't an animal. It wasn't sick or injured. It was something else. Something that watches, learns, waits. It didn't follow me, not directly, but I still check my windows at night. I still hear things in the trees sometimes when I go hiking. I don't stay out past dark anymore, and I don't talk about that cabin. Not unless someone really wants to know. Not unless they've seen something too. It was late autumn 2021 when I took a week off work to stay in a small rented cabin in Devon. I was 36 at the time, working long hours for a small engineering firm in Birmingham. I wasn't married, didn't have any kids, and I'd been putting off time off for months. When the pressure got too much and I started having trouble sleeping, I finally gave in and looked for a quiet place to reset. I didn't want to go abroad, and I wasn't in the mood for a beach holiday or city break. I wanted woods, rain, somewhere silent, somewhere I could disappear into for a bit without my phone constantly going off. I found the listing online, a small, detached wooden cabin tucked into the edge of Dartmoor, around 40 minutes outside of Exeter. The listing described it as perfect for solo travelers or couples seeking quiet. It was cheap, cheaper than it should have been, really. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, no television. Just a wood stove, an outdoor toilet, a generator for light, and a bed. The photos showed a rough, pine-paneled interior with a single narrow window on one wall and an old oil lantern on a shelf. It wasn't picturesque, but it had what I wanted. Nothing. I left early on a Sunday morning, just before sunrise, and made the 4-hour drive down. The weather was already changing. Clouds hung low all the way through Somerset, and a drizzle started halfway past Taunton. I passed the last village near the border of Dartmoor, a place called Holme, and turned onto a long, narrow country road. After about 15 minutes, the road curved into a dirt track that disappeared into the trees. My mobile signal dropped completely. It took me another 10 minutes to reach the cabin. It sat back from the track, surrounded on 3 sides by woods that felt old, damp, and forgotten. Moss covered the trees. The roof was rusted corrugated metal, and there were broken branches piled up near the back. The air smelled of wet leaves and smoke. I shut off the car and listened to the wind. It was exactly what I'd wanted. I let myself in with the key that had been posted to me by the owner. It was colder inside than out. The wood stove hadn't been used in a while. The air smelled stale, but not bad, just empty. I walked through the place slowly, getting a feel for it. There were no neighbors, no distant sounds of cars or dogs or anything mechanical. Just whined through the branches and an occasional creak from the trees. I lit the stove, unpacked my rucksack, and started settling in. I planned to spend most of the time reading, maybe walking, and getting my mind clear. The first couple of days were uneventful. The generator was temperamental, so I used the oil lantern most evenings. The silence took some getting used to. The first night I kept waking up to sounds in the woods, branches cracking, something scuffling in the undergrowth, but I knew it was probably just deer or foxes. The second night was better. I got used to the feel of the bed and the dark. The lantern gave off a soft yellow light, enough to read a bit before sleeping. I felt calm for the first time in months. On the third night, just after midnight, I woke up needing to use the toilet. It was cold, maybe 3 degrees, and the wind had picked up. I threw on my jacket and stepped outside with a small torch. The outdoor toilet was a little wooden box maybe 20 steps from the cabin. As I stepped out, I noticed something odd. There was a smell, faint but strange. Not foul, just unfamiliar, like rotting weeds or something left damp too long. I stood still for a second, shining the torch into the trees, but I didn't see anything, just the usual swaying branches. I finished and went back inside. When I looked out the small window before getting back into bed, I thought I saw a shape between the trees, pale, thin, but it was gone by the time I focused. I blamed the light and went back to sleep. The next day, I walked a couple of miles down the track. The weather stayed gray and heavy. I didn't see anyone. No houses, no cars. I'd brought enough food for the week, so I had no reason to leave. When I got back, the cabin felt colder than usual. The fire had gone out. I lit it again and kept my jacket on while I boiled water for tea. That smell was back. Faint again, but there. I sniffed around the stove and the corners, trying to see if something had gotten damp, but nothing stood out. I opened the door to air it out and left it open for half an hour while I walked a short loop around the trees behind the cabin. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but I woke again around 2 in the morning. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. Then I realized I was cold. The fire had died, and the blanket had slipped off the bed. I got up to fix the stove and caught a sound, quiet, sharp, like someone stepping on twigs just outside. I froze. I waited, holding my breath, ears wide open. The sound didn't repeat. After a minute, I stepped to the window and looked out. I held the lantern up, but it barely reached the edge of the trees. I scanned the ground, the space between the trunks, and then I saw it. A figure, thin, still, standing between 2 trees maybe 15 meters back. I could barely make her out, but it was clearly a woman. Not moving, just standing. Pale face, black hair, dark clothing. I stared for maybe 10 seconds, heart pounding, and then the light flickered, and when it came back up, she was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up, fire going again, knife in hand. I kept thinking maybe it was someone lost, maybe a hiker or a local or a squatter. I couldn't think of why someone would be out there, alone at that time, watching the cabin. The next morning, I walked around the area where I thought she'd stood. There were no prints. The ground was soft enough that something should have shown, but there was nothing, just moss and damp soil. I walked the perimeter 3 times. Nothing. I didn't see her again that day or that night, but I started keeping the lantern closer to the bed. I stopped walking far. I kept the door locked at all times. That smell started showing up more often, stronger. It wasn't just rot. It smelled like wet cloth, old skin. It stayed in the corners of the cabin. I even checked the walls for mold, but didn't find anything. On the 6th night, the lantern blew out while I was reading. The fire was low. I got up to check the fuel can and heard the noise again, outside. But this time it wasn't one sound. It was a shuffle, then a second one. Not fast, just slow, like someone dragging something heavy. I turned off the generator and stood still in the dark, listening. It stopped. I walked to the window, careful not to make noise, and waited. After maybe a minute, I saw movement. Someone stepped just into view, a few meters from the front of the cabin. It was her, the same woman. She was closer now. I could see her better. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were bare, gray with dirt. Her clothes looked soaked, like she'd been walking through marsh. Her hair was matted to the sides of her face, and she held her arms stiff at her sides. She looked directly at the window, not just at the cabin, at me. Her eyes were dark, deep-set, her mouth slightly open. She didn't blink. I backed away from the window, grabbed the axe I'd brought for firewood, and moved to the far side of the room. I waited for something. A knock. a sound. But she didn't move. She just stood there. For hours. Eventually, the sky started to lighten. When I looked again, she was gone. I packed everything in 10 minutes. I shoved everything into my rucksack, turned off the generator, and ran to the car. I didn't look back. I drove the track as fast as I could without blowing a tire, mud spraying up against the sides. I made it back to home by 8 a.m. and parked outside a small cafe until they opened. I didn't go back. I didn't report anything. I just left. I never told anyone, not properly. I didn't want to hear theories or ghost stories. I knew what I saw. She was real. Not a spirit, not a myth. Just a woman, but not one I ever want to meet again. Not someone who belonged anywhere near other people. A month later, I checked the listing. It was gone. I still think about it sometimes. That stare. The way she stood. What she was doing out there. There's a reason some places are cheap. Some places are forgotten on purpose. And some people live out in the woods not because they want peace, but because no one else wants to be near them. That week in Devon changed me. I don't go looking for quiet anymore. I was 38 the summer I decided to take some time away from everything. It was 2017, and life had gotten heavy. I'd been working nonstop in a warehouse in Dayton, Ohio for nearly 12 years without a real break. My wife had left the previous winter. We didn't have kids, but her absence was like a void in the apartment. We'd both made mistakes, but she'd pulled the plug first. That left me spinning my wheels in a half-empty place, coming home to silence, eating takeout straight from the bag. My therapist had told me to try changing my routine. That meant more than just switching my morning coffee spot. I needed to actually step away, physically remove myself from the things that made me numb. I took a leave from work, packed up my old Jeep Cherokee, and headed east with no set destination. Just open roads, campgrounds, cheap motels, and hopefully some peace. About a week in, I crossed into Pennsylvania, winding through back roads in the Allegheny region. The roads there get narrower the deeper you go. Gas stations become scarce, and you start to see more deer than people. I found a campground near a small town called Deerfield. The campground itself was nothing fancy, just a handful of spots carved into the trees, a fire pit here and there, and a few cleared trails that led to streams. I stayed 3 nights, kept to myself, hiked a little, and read a lot. On the second evening, an old guy with a camo hat and a pickup truck stopped by my site. He wasn't unfriendly, just brief. He asked if I was from around there. I told him no, just passing through. He nodded like he expected that. Then he told me something odd. Said there was an old cabin deeper in the woods if I liked that kind of old crap. His words. Said it had belonged to a family back in the 60s, and no one had touched it in decades. No road led to it anymore, just a forgotten trail off the north edge of the woods. He didn't give me a warning or tell me not to go. He just said I'd know it when I saw it. Then he got in his truck and drove off. The next morning, I packed some water, snacks, and my knife. Nothing big, just the one I carried when hiking. I had no real plans for the day, so I figured I'd go looking for that old place. Not because I was into old crap, but because something about the way the man mentioned it stuck with me. I walked north past the last campsite and followed a thin trail that started at the base of a dried-up creek bed. It wasn't marked, but you could tell something had passed that way often enough to leave a faint track. I kept going for about an hour. The woods thickened. Sunlight barely broke through the canopy. The deeper I went, the more silent it became. I started to feel far from everything, like I'd stepped out of time. Eventually, I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, swallowed in vines and shadow. It was smaller than I expected, just 1 story, probably 3 rooms. The wood siding had gone gray with age, and most of the windows were either broken or missing. The front door was still on its hinges but crooked. The whole place leaned slightly to one side, like it had been caught mid-collapse but frozen that way. I walked the perimeter first, brushing off the buzzing of horseflies and the slap of thorny branches. The back of the cabin had a caved-in porch and the remains of a rusted oil drum. I saw old tire tracks, maybe from decades ago, almost fossilized into the dirt. I stepped up to the door. It didn't take much to push it open. Inside, the air was thick. It didn't smell like rot exactly, more like mold and dust and something metallic. The floor was warped and buckled in places. Bits of broken furniture were scattered around. A busted chair, a table with one leg missing, a collapsed couch with the stuffing ripped out. The kitchen area still had a few broken dishes in the sink. Mice droppings peppered the floor, and spider webs filled the corners. But it wasn't the decay that got to me, it was the feeling. That sense you get when you walk into a space that's been left to time. Like the world kept turning, but this place didn't get the memo. I checked each room carefully. One bedroom had a rusted bed frame and nothing else. The other had a closet door that wouldn't shut properly and a mildewed mattress curled against the wall. The bathroom was barely recognizable. Just rust-streaked tiles and a sink detached from the wall. Still, I felt pulled to stay there longer than I should have. I sat for a bit on the front step, drank some water, and wrote in my notebook. Just quick things. Impressions. The quiet. The smell. The way the trees leaned in like they were hiding something. Could have left then. I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I went back inside and started digging a little deeper. In the kitchen cabinets, I found some rusted cans, all labels worn off. In one drawer near the sink, I found old cutlery, most of it corroded. The weirdest part was in the corner near the fireplace. There was a loose floorboard. I saw it only because a dead beetle had fallen through the crack. When I pried it open, I found a small compartment underneath. Inside was a box metal green, the kind you'd expect to find in an army surplus store. It was locked, but the lock had rusted enough that I cracked it open with a rock. Inside were photos, black and white ones mostly, a few in color. All of them had the same boy in them, blonde hair, around 10 or 11. He was in every photo, no matter what. Sometimes standing with adults, sometimes by himself in front of the cabin. In some, he was holding a rifle. In others, he just stood there, arms at his sides. I flipped through dozens of them. Then I found a few that chilled me. They weren't of the boy at all. They were of the woods, taken from the inside of the cabin, looking out. One showed the front porch, empty. Another showed the trail. And in the last few, there was a man in the distance, just barely visible behind trees. His posture changed in each one. First, he was facing away. Then he was turned slightly. Then he was facing the camera straight on. No expression, just standing there. It didn't feel like art. It felt like evidence. I put the photos back in the box and decided to leave right then. But when I opened the front door, something stopped me. A pile of stones had been placed just outside the door, stacked neatly, not there before, about the size of a basketball. Someone had been there while I was inside. I scanned the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the stillness felt sharper than it had before, like the woods were holding their breath. I stepped around the stones and walked fast, back the way I came. I kept my knife in my hand and checked over my shoulder every few minutes. No sounds, no birds, no wind. Just the crunch of my boots and the pounding in my chest. When I got back to camp, I packed everything. Didn't sleep. Drove out at first light. I reported what I'd found at the next town's sheriff's station. Not because I thought they'd care about old photos or stones, but because something didn't sit right. The deputy on duty jotted it down and told me people dump weird stuff in those woods all the time. That was it. I went home after that. Back in Dayton, things returned to normal, or the version of normal I'd come to expect. I went back to work, ate the same dinners, watched the same shows. But sometimes I think about that boy, the way he stared out of every photo, like he was watching something we couldn't see. I still have the box. I kept it in a locked case in the back of my closet. I don't open it, haven't touched it in years, but I know it's there. A reminder of what I found in the woods outside Deerfield. A place the world forgot, but someone or something didn't, and I never did figure out who stacked those stones, or how long they'd been watching me. It was early October 2004 when I got the idea to go back to the cabin. I hadn't thought about the place in years, not since I was a teenager. Back then, my Uncle Paul owned it, and he'd take me and my cousin Thomas up there a couple times each year during hunting season. The cabin was deep in the forests of western Maine, about an hour's drive past Rangeley, near the border with New Hampshire. It was isolated, old, and hadn't been used since Paul died in '97. I was 32 at the time, working maintenance at a community college in Portland. I lived alone, didn't have much tying me down. My girlfriend had left the year before, and my mother was in assisted living in Augusta. I kept busy, but I felt hollow. That fall, I started looking through old photo albums one night and found a picture of me, Paul, and Thomas sitting on the front steps of the cabin. The image had that faded, grainy look old prints get, like the color had bled out of it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I started wondering if the place was still there. That idea stuck in my head for days. I started checking maps, tracking down back roads, trying to figure out how to get there again. Eventually, I found the old route, traced it on a printed map, and figured I could make the trip in a day. I had a long weekend coming up, 3 days off in a row, so I packed a small bag, some canned food, a flashlight, knife, and a little camping stove. I brought an old .22 rifle too, just in case I ran into anything. Not that I planned to hunt, but being out there alone without something felt wrong. I left Portland around 6 in the morning and reached Rangeley by mid-morning. From there, it was another long stretch through winding roads, most of them not marked on any GPS. I passed through a couple tiny towns, a few trailers, one gas station with a rusted-out canopy, and then nothing but trees. The last 30 miles were on an old dirt logging road. I hadn't seen another car in almost an hour. By the time I reached the area where I thought the cabin should be, the road had narrowed to 2 rutted tire tracks. Pine needles blanketed everything. I pulled off into a clearing and cut the engine. The air felt dense, damp, filled with the smell of moss and rot. I grabbed my backpack and rifle and started walking. It took me longer than I expected to find it. The woods had changed. Trees had fallen. Paths had overgrown. I almost gave up when I spotted a familiar bend in a creek that ran near the back of the cabin. I followed it upstream and finally saw the roof line, just barely poking through the trees. The place looked worse than I remembered. The paint was almost entirely gone, wood blackened by time and weather. One of the shutters hung off at an angle, and the front door had warped off its frame. A sapling had taken root near the porch. I stood there for a while, staring. It felt smaller than I remembered. I walked up slowly, my boots crunching through wet leaves and twigs. Inside, it was dark, damp, and smelled like mold and old wood. The furniture was still there, collapsed and half-rotted. Mice had chewed through the seat cushions. A few empty beer cans and a torn sleeping bag were scattered in the corner. Someone had clearly squatted there at some point. I checked the small kitchen area, then the back room. The place was empty, quiet, too quiet. I spent the rest of that day cleaning out what I could. I set up my little stove, unrolled my sleeping bag, and cleared a space near the fireplace, though I had no plans to light one. The chimney had likely been blocked for years, and I didn't want to smoke myself out. That night was rough. Couldn't sleep. The forest was too loud. Every creak, every rustle made me sit up and listen. The wind pushed against the trees, and I could hear branches snapping far off. I told myself it was normal, just animals, but deep down I knew I didn't feel right being there. I woke up stiff and cold the next morning. My neck ached, and my mouth was dry. I got the stove going, heated up some beans, and then walked the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was thicker than I remembered. More undergrowth, more trees. I tried to retrace the old trails Paul used to take us on, but they were gone. I ended up bushwhacking for an hour before realizing I'd circled back to the creek again. Still, it was peaceful. I started thinking maybe I could fix the place up. Maybe spend weekends here, clear the trails, make something of it. But then I found the shoes. They were near the base of a tree, maybe 100 feet behind the cabin. 2 boots, scuffed and split at the soles, placed neatly side by side like someone had just stepped out of them. That wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the faded pair of socks still inside, stiff and curled like someone had worn them for days without taking them off. I crouched down, examined them. They were dry but smelled of mildew. Old, but not decades old. I looked around. No other trash, no backpack, no sign of a person. I took a few photos with my phone, then walked back to the cabin, uneasy. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I know how that sounds, but something in me said to do it. I didn't like those boots. Didn't like how quiet the woods had gotten after dark. I didn't sleep much again. The next morning, I decided to hike further out, see if I could find any sign of who might have been out there. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they left in a hurry. I brought my rifle and some jerky, thinking I'd be back by mid-afternoon. I headed north, following a barely visible path that led uphill toward an old hunting blind Paul and I had once used. About half a mile in, I found more signs: broken branches, disturbed moss, flattened grass. Not fresh, but recent enough. I kept following the trail. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to know. Eventually, I reached the old blind. It was still there, barely standing, the wood warped and collapsing. I climbed halfway up the ladder and stopped. On the platform was a pile of bones. Not arranged, just scattered. Some were broken. Some had bits of fur still clinging to them. Deer, maybe, but there were too many pieces for one animal. And beside them, another boot. Same kind as the pair I'd seen. But this one had dried blood crusted around the opening. I got down and started heading back fast. The light was fading, and I took a wrong turn somewhere. I ended up deep in the woods with no sign of the cabin. I checked my phone, no signal. I knew I needed to move fast. It would be dark soon. I pushed through the brush, heart pounding, every snapping twig behind me making my chest tighten. I didn't see anyone, but I felt like I was being watched. That old, instinctive fear that makes the back of your neck tingle. When I finally saw the cabin again through the trees, I almost ran to it. I got inside, slammed the door, shoved the chair back against it, and sat there, breathing hard. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat there until morning. I left at first light, didn't even pack properly, just threw everything into my bag and retraced my steps to the truck. The road felt longer this time. I checked behind me constantly. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove all the way back to Portland without a break. Later that week, I went to the sheriff's office, told them about the boots, the bones, the blind. A deputy took my statement, nodded, said he'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything back. I called twice, once in November, again in January. Both times, I was told the matter had been looked into. That was it. Sometimes I dream about it, about those woods, about that blind, about walking into the cabin and finding someone already sitting inside. I don't go camping anymore. I don't hike much either. Something changed in me out there. That silence, the kind you only find deep in the forest. It's not peaceful anymore. feels like something waiting, but I know what I saw, I know what I found, and I know that whoever left those boots didn't walk out of those woods. It was early October of 2016 when my wife, Abby, suggested we spend a week at her grandmother's old cabin in northern Vermont. Her grandmother had passed the year before, and no one had really stayed in the cabin since then. Abby said it would be good for both of us. Time away from our phones, the city, the traffic, and especially my job. At the time, I was 33 and working as a maintenance supervisor for a logistics company near Albany. Long hours, night shifts, and non-stop noise from machines made me jumpy, tired, and a bit short-fused. Abby was a teacher, calm by nature, and always pushing for a quieter life. When she brought up the idea of the cabin, I said yes, more for her sake than mine. The cabin sat on the edge of a slope that ran into a narrow valley, surrounded by thick woods that went up and down for miles. It was a one-floor structure, dark brown and weathered, with a small covered porch and a stone chimney. Abby's grandmother, Lorraine, had lived there for decades after her husband passed, and Abby spent most summers of her childhood there. We left on a Sunday morning and got to the cabin by late afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the tree line when we pulled into the long dirt path that led up to the property. The driveway curved gently and ended in a small clearing. The cabin looked mostly intact, though I noticed the roof sagged a little on one side and a shutter hung crooked near the kitchen window. There was no power, no running water. The place had always been off-grid. A generator sat in the shed behind the cabin, and the water came from a well and an old pump system that Lorraine had maintained herself for years. Abby found the keys tucked inside a rusted lantern by the porch swing, exactly where her grandmother used to keep them. The first few hours were peaceful. We unloaded supplies, opened all the windows to air the place out, and got a small fire going in the stone fireplace. The chimney drew well, and the smell of burning oak filled the place with a kind of familiar warmth. Abby was glowing. She moved around with a kind of practiced ease, remembering little things like where to store the dry goods and how to get the old gas stove going. We went to bed early that night. The mattress was old but not terrible, and the sheets, though musty, had been kept clean in vacuum-sealed bags. I lay in bed, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar stillness around us. No cars, no sirens, no humming appliances, just the occasional crack of wood cooling in the fireplace and the quiet chirp of crickets outside. I woke up just before dawn to use the bathroom. The inside toilet didn't work anymore, so we had to use the outhouse about 30 feet down a gravel path behind the shed. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on a hoodie, and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. Mist hung low over the grass, and I could barely see the woods at the end of the slope. As I walked, I caught a strange sound, like something crunching through dead leaves in the distance. It was slow and heavy. I stopped and aimed the flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing. I waited another few seconds, didn't hear it again, and finished my business. The next morning, I told Abby about it. She said it was probably a deer or moose. The area was full of them, she said. Black bears too, but they didn't usually come that close unless there was food. I didn't mention that the sound hadn't seemed like any animal I'd heard before. Something about the pacing of it was deliberate. Still, I shook it off. The next 2 days were calm. We cut firewood, hiked the old trails Abby used to walk as a kid, cooked simple meals, and even played a few board games by lamplight. The place grew on me. It was the kind of silence that made your thoughts clearer. The noise of life faded. I could feel my shoulders loosen and even started to sleep deeper. But on the third night, things changed. It started around 11 p.m. I was half asleep when I heard a creak from the front porch. Not a squirrel-type noise or something light. A full wooden groan like weight shifting. I held my breath and listened. Another sound, softer, what I can only describe as the slight thud of a footfall. Then nothing. I sat up, slid my legs out of bed, and tiptoed to the front window. The curtains were thin, just enough to see vague outlines. I couldn't make anything out clearly, but I thought I saw a shape move past the porch swing. Just a flicker of motion, gone as fast as it came. I didn't wake Abby. I just stood there, staring into the dark until my eyes ached. Finally, I went back to bed, telling myself it could have been a bear or even a tree branch shifting in the wind. But I knew something was off. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. I checked the ground around the porch and noticed faint depressions in the dirt. 2 or 3 spots where the pine needles were crushed down. No clear footprints, just enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Abby stayed upbeat, brushing it off with a joke and saying I was just used to city noise and now every sound felt bigger. That afternoon, we hiked a trail that wrapped around the back of the property and looped over the slope behind the cabin. Halfway through, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the far side of the slope, maybe 200 feet downhill, there was an old tree with bark stripped off one side. Not clawed, peeled, like someone had carefully removed wide sheets of it, layer by layer. Near the base of the tree were piles of stones, stacked in strange, unbalanced towers. 5 or 6 of them, each about knee-high. They looked freshly placed. The stones were damp, some even mossy, but the stacks looked deliberate, clean. I asked Abby if she remembered them from before. She didn't. She looked uneasy but said maybe some kids had been messing around out there recently. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. Movement on the porch, then a long pause. Then something brushed against the side of the cabin. I held my breath, the sound of gravel shifting, then footsteps moving around toward the back. I grabbed the flashlight, got dressed, and stepped outside. The night was thick with fog. I followed the sound, moving around to the rear of the cabin, past the shed, and down the path to the outhouse. My heart thudded in my chest. Every branch looked like a figure. Every leaf crack felt like it had weight behind it. At the outhouse, I stopped. Nothing, just silence. Then, behind me, up the slope, a rustle. I turned fast, light scanning the woods. Again, nothing. But I knew, in my gut, something had been watching us, maybe for days. The next morning, I told Abby I wanted to leave early. She didn't argue. Something about the mood had shifted. Even she could feel it. We spent the day packing up, cleaning, securing things. Around late afternoon, I walked out back one more time, needing to clear my head. I wandered down the slope, back to the area with the stripped tree and the rock piles. When I got there, they were gone. Every stone, gone. In their place were small holes in the ground, like the stones had been taken and something had been buried. I felt sick. I turned around and started back. As I climbed the slope, I spotted something lodged in a tree trunk. A piece of torn fabric, dark green, like canvas. Looked like part of a jacket. Not Abby's, not mine. That was the final straw. We left the next morning. On the drive back, I felt like I was peeling something off me, like I'd been walking around with wet clothes for days and finally got dry again. Neither of us spoke much until we got past Montpelier and back on the interstate. A week later, I filed a report with the local sheriff's office. I left out the part about the fabric and the rocks. I just said we thought someone might be squatting near the property, maybe watching the cabin. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never followed up. I didn't want to know. Abby agreed to sell the property the following spring. We found a buyer, an older couple looking to live off-grid. We didn't mention anything to them. Maybe we should have. I don't know. All I know is that what I heard, what I saw, it was real. Not a ghost or some movie monster. Just someone or something who didn't want us there. A real person, maybe even living in those woods. watching, waiting, maybe doing something worse. And I think about the slope behind that cabin more often than I'd like. I was 38 that year, working seasonal jobs and picking up small builds for private landowners who didn't want to deal with contractors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me solitude and paid well enough to get by without answering to anyone. Most of my contracts came from word of mouth, usually handed off from one landowner to another out in the hills of western North Carolina. In late September of 2021, a man named Curtis asked if I could build a single-room cabin deep on his wooded property just outside of Waynesville. He gave me GPS coordinates and told me I'd have to hike in about a mile with a UTV and trailer to get to the clearing. No cell signal out there, no power, just a patch of land he said he used to hunt on. Said he wanted a weather-tight, insulated box with a sleeping loft, with stovepipe, and a few small windows. Nothing pretty, just solid and dry. I said yes. That week, I picked up the basic supplies, treated 4x4 posts, OSB sheathing, 2x6S for floor joists, 2x4S for framing, roofing metal, underlayment, and enough insulation to wrap the inside. Kept it lean. I'd haul in most of it over 2 days, make a few runs with the trailer, and hike in the rest on foot. The first 2 days were dry, and I managed to dig the post holes, square up the deck, and get the floor joists framed and sheathed. Nothing fancy, just a 12 by 16 cabin with a 6-foot porch and a loft framed into the roofline. I was moving fast because I knew the rain was coming. You can feel it in the hills, the way the air presses down, heavy and still. Forecast said 2 full days of storms rolling in from the south. I wanted at least the roof on before it hit. I worked late into the third night, and by sundown I had the walls framed and braced. The next morning, I was back at it by first light, alone in that clearing with a thermos of coffee, 2 granola bars, and the sound of nothing but birds and trees. I framed the rafters and tied them in by noon, got the sheathing on by 2. That's when the sky started to dim. Not fast like a storm front, slow and steady, like the clouds were stacking into the ridges around me. I climbed up and started rolling out the underlayment, trying to beat the rain. I didn't care about the walls yet. I just needed the roof done. I could wrap the cabin in house wrap the next day and start getting it sealed tight. But if that roof wasn't finished, all my work so far would be soaked, maybe warped beyond repair. The first drops came down before I'd screwed in the last panel. Big, fat raindrops that hit like marbles. I was crouched on the ridge, tightening the last screw through a piece of corrugated steel when the sky opened up. I climbed down soaked. It was around 5, and the woods already felt like night. Thunder cracked miles away. I grabbed my bag and ducked into the half-finished cabin. No walls wrapped, no door yet, just open studs and half-nailed corners. But the roof held, and the deck stayed dry. I'd left my tent in the UTV trailer, but I wasn't about to hike back in that downpour. Besides, I was tired and sore, and figured I could sleep inside the shell out of the rain. The wind picked up as I unrolled a tarp across the floor and laid my sleeping bag on top. I had a small propane heater, a few cans of food, a flashlight, and a couple tools I hadn't put away yet. I sealed the rest of the OSB sheets over the porch opening to keep the rain from blowing in. Felt like a cave. Dark, tight, safe enough. But it didn't feel right. I've worked in remote places most of my life. Built cabins in Wyoming, bridges in Alaska, trail camps in Tennessee. You get used to quiet. You get used to the wind, the animals, the sounds of trees shifting around you. But that night, something about the silence inside the storm made my skin crawl. It wasn't that anything happened right away. It was the way the woods outside didn't sound like woods anymore.
No birds, no owls.
No rustle in the trees, just wind and rain, hammering the roof in waves like drumbeats. I sat in the middle of the cabin in the dark, flashlight off, and listened. The floor was solid, The corners were plumb. I knew that, but I felt like the thing was breathing. Not literally, it was shifting in the wind, expanding, creaking. I could hear it strain with each gust, the way fresh wood does before it settles. The ridge beam above me groaned. Nails popped in and out like the building itself was deciding whether to hold together or not. Around 9, I tried to sleep. Couldn't. I kept imagining shapes through the open window frames. Kept seeing shadows move across the floor even though I knew it was just wind in the trees and the light of my lantern bouncing off the plastic-wrapped insulation. I shut the lantern off completely and laid there with one ear to the floor, hearing the ground hum from the weight of the storm. Then I heard something else. Not thunder, not wind. It was a thud. Not loud, not close, but real. It came from outside the cabin, maybe 30 feet off into the woods. A single, dull impact. Then nothing. I sat up. Rain hammered the roof. The walls flinched. I picked up my flashlight and scanned the window openings, but all I could see were sheets of water and blackness. Another thud. Closer. I turned off the light again and listened. Third one came 5 minutes later. Louder, almost inside the clearing. I know deer move in storms. I've seen them stand motionless for hours in the thick of a downpour. But deer don't thud. They step, snap, pause. They don't make blunt, echoing impacts like that, unless they fall. But 3 times, I waited and waited. After a long time, I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. My body was exhausted. My hands were cracked and sore, but my mind kept spinning. Every creak in the cabin sounded like footsteps. Every drop of rain sounded like breath against the wall. At some point around midnight, I sat up again, sweating inside my bag, and peeled off my jacket. My shirt stuck to me. I felt feverish, but I wasn't sick. I was wired, strung out on fear I couldn't name. Then, without warning, the plywood I'd stacked at the far end of the cabin shifted. I heard it. A dry scrape, just one, but no wind could move those. They were stacked against the studs, tight and flat. I picked up my hammer. Not a gun, I don't carry one. Just a hammer. I walked across the floor and checked the stack. It hadn't fallen, but the top sheet had shifted maybe a 1/4 inch. Enough to make sound. I held still. My back was cold with sweat. I leaned closer and smelled something. Wet earth. Wood, and something sharp. Metal? Couldn't tell. I stayed there, crouched in the dark, for I don't know how long. The rain pounded the roof like fists. Then the hammer slipped in my hand and hit the plywood with a sharp knock. And something moved outside. This wasn't a thud. It was a shuffle. Fast. Close. Then gone. I turned the light back on. Still nothing. I stayed up until morning. The rain slowed just after dawn, and the woods came back to life. Birds chirped. Leaves hissed with leftover water. The air was thick and cool. I packed my things and didn't speak a word out loud, even to myself. I walked the perimeter of the clearing and didn't find tracks. No sign of anything large. Nothing broken or bent. But near the back edge, where the slope dropped off toward the creek, I found one thing. A hole. Just one. About 4 inches wide. Maybe 10 inches deep. Freshly dug. No tool marks. Just rough edges like something scraped it out fast. Could have been an animal. A raccoon maybe. But the soil was clean. No claw marks. No scat. Just a narrow pit in the wet clay, like someone had stabbed the ground with a stake and twisted it out. I filled it in with my boot and walked back to the cabin. I worked all day, fast and focused. I wrapped the house, cut and nailed in the window bucks, braced the corners. But I never turned my back to the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. The next night I hiked out, slept in my truck at the bottom of the hill. I didn't go back for 2 days. When I did, the cabin was still standing. No damage. No mess. Everything exactly where I left it. But the hole was back. Same place, same size, same depth. Dug again. I didn't tell Curtis. Didn't write it in the report or include it in the invoice. I finished the cabin, sealed it tight, installed the stovepipe and loft, trimmed the corners. Took me 3 more days. I slept in the UTV trailer every night. On the final day, I took one last look at the clearing before I hiked out. The sky was clear. The trees were calm. The cabin stood clean and silent in the center of the slope, doors shut, windows locked. And at the far edge of the trees, near the creek bed, a second hole had appeared. Then a third. I didn't go look. I never went back. Curtis paid me in full. Said the cabin turned out better than he expected. Said he stayed 1 weekend in October and heard coyotes all night, but nothing unusual. He asked if I'd be willing to build a woodshed out there in spring. I told him I wasn't taking any more remote builds for now. He didn't ask why. I've built 6 more cabins since then. All in town, near roads, close to houses. I don't go more than half a mile into the woods anymore unless I know the land like my own face. And I don't work in the rain. Not ever. Because I know what I heard that night in the clearing. And I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was something human. And whoever they were watching me from the woods, moving in the dark, digging holes near a 1-room cabin I was building in the middle of nowhere. And they never left footprints. It was a Monday in early November when I decided to take the long way back home from a work trip in northern Oregon. The sun dipped early this time of year, and the trees were nearly bare along most of the back roads. The air had that cold, wet bite to it. Not snow, not yet, but damp enough that my fingers felt stiff on the wheel, even with the heater turned up. I was 39. It had been 5 years since I divorced Mark, and I hadn't been anywhere near Ridgeview since then. That's where we used to live, or at least where we owned a cabin. The kind of place people build when they think they'll be happy forever. It sat a few miles out from the main road, up on a ridge that overlooked a slow, curving river. I always thought it was too far from everything. Mark thought it was perfect. We were married for 6 years. It ended in the usual way. Fights, distance, resentment. He got the cabin in the divorce. I never asked what he did with it. I didn't care. At least I thought I didn't. On the way back south from Medford, I saw the old exit sign for Ridgeview. I almost didn't take it, but traffic had backed up on the main route, and I was in no mood to sit for hours. I figured the side road would cut an hour off the drive. And somewhere inside me, I think I needed to know what the place looked like now. Not the cabin necessarily, but the whole stretch of woods and empty road we used to call home. I didn't plan on stopping, just passing by. The sun had dipped behind the ridge when I turned off onto that narrow, winding road. I remembered it well. The trees hung low, and the road was uneven, patched in places but still cracked from winter ice. There weren't any other cars. No lights, just me, my car, and the gray hush of evening coming down all around. The road forked near the old bridge. The left took you deeper into Ridgeview town proper. I went right, toward the river bend, toward the cabin. I didn't mean to. My hands just turned the wheel before I had time to think. About a mile in, the trees opened up a little and I saw it. The cabin hadn't changed much. Still dark brown, still crouched in the trees like something half forgotten. The roof sagged a little, but the windows looked intact. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, but tire tracks were visible. Not recent, maybe a week or 2 old, but not ancient either. Someone had been here. I slowed the car. Not stopped, just enough to look. The porch light was off, curtains drawn. Nothing unusual, but something didn't sit right. Couldn't name it. Maybe the way the woods pressed in closer than I remembered. Maybe how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, just the low hum of my engine and the sudden feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw the back door. The way the cabin was built, the back entrance sat low on the slope behind the house, half hidden by tall grass and the rise of the ridge. You couldn't normally see it from the road unless you stopped and angled your view just right. But I caught a glimpse. The door was open, not all the way, just enough to be wrong. I stopped the car. My hands were sweating. I should have kept driving. Instead, I pulled into the gravel, careful not to bump over the rocks too hard. The car crunched slow, tires pushing against the soft dirt and weeds. I parked maybe 10 feet from the porch. I told myself I was just going to look. Just get out and look. Maybe the wind blew the door open. Maybe animals. I wasn't going to go inside. But the moment I opened the car door, the silence hit me harder than I expected. No movement. Not even the sound of the river. Just a thick, padded stillness like the woods had soaked up all sound. I stepped out. The ground was cold, wet through the soles of my boots. Leaves stuck to my legs as I walked up the porch steps, careful not to make too much noise. I peeked through the front window. Dark. I moved around the side, down the sloped path Mark used to rake every fall, toward the back door. The door was still ajar, not kicked in, not broken, just hanging slightly open like someone forgot to latch it. The air coming out was musty, but beneath it there was something else. Something sharp, metallic. I should have turned around. Instead, I stepped inside. The kitchen was exactly how I remembered it. Old wooden counters, sink stained from rust and time, a single overhead light that didn't flick on when I tried the switch. The table was still there, same chairs, but there were things scattered on it, old food wrappers, a mug, a folded knife. I moved deeper. The living room smelled like mildew and dust. The fireplace hadn't been used in ages, but there were signs someone had been here. A blanket on the floor, a pair of boots near the door, a stack of grocery store receipts on the coffee table, dated 2 weeks ago, from a store in Grants Pass. The air got heavier the farther I went in. I didn't want to go upstairs, but my legs kept moving. The steps creaked, and I flinched with every sound. The upstairs bedroom was empty, so was the spare room. But when I opened the closet, I found something that made my stomach drop. A phone, one of those prepaid ones, battery dead, and a small bag half-packed with men's clothes, some cash, and a notebook. The front cover was plain, black. I opened it. Inside were pages of handwriting. None of it made sense at first. Just short entries, locations, times, names I didn't recognize, until I flipped to the middle and saw my name. 3 times, written in bold ink, circled.
No explanations.
Just my name and a date, last week. My mouth went dry. I flipped more pages. A drawing, a map maybe, of Ridgeview, lines drawn to the cabin, arrows. I stuffed the notebook in my coat. My instincts screamed at me to leave. Get in the car. Don't stop. Don't think. I made it halfway down the stairs when I heard the sound. From outside, not a vehicle, not footsteps, just a scrape, like something heavy being dragged across gravel. I froze. The front window gave me a partial view of the driveway. A truck was parked behind mine. Black, old, mud-caked tires. Driver's door still open. No one inside. I didn't wait. I ran. Through the back door, down the slope, away from the driveway. I didn't care about being quiet now. Just distance. I ducked into the woods, heart punching against my ribs. I didn't stop running until the cabin was a memory behind the trees. I found a place to crouch behind a thick fallen log and listened. Voices, 2 of them, low, sharp. Then the sound of my trunk being opened. Then nothing. They didn't follow me into the woods. At least not right away. I stayed hidden for hours. The light drained out of the sky until everything was dark. Cold seeped into my skin. I held the notebook like a shield. My phone had no signal. I waited until I was sure they were gone. Then I crept back toward the road. The truck was gone. So was mine. Gone. Just the tire tracks left behind, heading toward the ridge road. I walked all night, 8 miles to the highway. No cars stopped. No lights. At dawn, I reached a gas station and called the police. They found my car 2 days later, abandoned outside Klamath Falls, wiped clean, nothing inside. The truck was never found. Neither were the men. I gave the notebook to the police. They opened an investigation. They found fingerprints, but no matches, no leads, just a lot of questions. They asked me if Mark might have had enemies. I said I didn't know. I hadn't spoken to him in years. That was true, but it wasn't the full truth. A month later, I got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single page. One sentence. You shouldn't have come back. That was 6 months ago. I moved. New house, new job. Changed my number. I don't take back roads anymore. I don't know who those men were, or what they were doing in the cabin, or why my name was in that notebook. But I think Mark knew. I think he got involved with something he shouldn't have. And when he vanished, someone thought I knew something. I didn't. Still don't. But that doesn't matter, because someone's still out there, and they remember me. It was early spring when I first arrived at the cabin, tucked deep into the woods of upstate New York. The air was still crisp, and the trees had that fresh, earthy scent that comes with the season. I'd signed up for this project at the last minute. The idea had seemed simple enough: spend a few weeks in solitude, studying insect species for a medical research grant. It wasn't the kind of work I was used to, but the isolation would give me the peace I needed to focus. The cabin was old. I wasn't sure how old, but the wood had the dull grayish hue that comes from decades of exposure to the elements. The place was one room with a small kitchen and a bathroom off to the side. There was no internet, no phone signal. Nothing but the sound of wind rustling the trees and the occasional animal moving through the brush. Perfect for someone like me, someone who needed to get away from the world for a while. When I'd arrived, the cabin had been pre-stocked with enough supplies to last me through the month. Food, water, and a basic first aid kit. There was also a rather large box filled with equipment for collecting specimens, nets, vials, and even some traps for larger insects like beetles and moths. My research focused on the role insects played in medical science, specifically in how certain species could be used to help develop new treatments for diseases. My job was to observe, catalog, and study. I had no experience with anything this rural, but I'd grown up in a small town and had spent my fair share of time outdoors. I figured I could handle a few weeks of isolation. The first couple of days were uneventful. I set up my equipment and started to explore the surrounding woods. There were plenty of insects, mosquitoes, beetles, and flies. Some of them I recognized from my research, others I had never seen before. Each evening, I'd come back to the cabin, bring in my specimens, and record my findings. But there was something unsettling about the place. It wasn't anything tangible at first, but after a few days, I started to notice the oddities. The way the trees stood too still, as if they were watching. The rustling in the underbrush, which never seemed to have a source. The faint hum in the air that I couldn't place, like the buzz of an electrical current running through the cabin's walls, even though the place didn't have electricity. On the fourth night, things took a turn. I'd been out collecting specimens when I noticed something strange. A pattern in the ground, something I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the moon shone through the trees, but then I saw it again. The ground was disturbed in a series of strange lines, almost like someone, or something, had been dragging something heavy through the dirt. I felt my heart rate increase. I wasn't alone out here. The next day, I decided to follow the tracks. They led deeper into the woods, and as I moved farther from the cabin, the air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. The tracks wound in a spiraling pattern, almost like a trail leading nowhere, yet it felt like it was beckoning me further. It took every ounce of my willpower to not turn back. What could it be? An animal? Person? After an hour of following the trail, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A small clearing. In the middle of it was a pile of scattered leaves and broken branches. And in the center, half buried, was a large wooden box. It didn't look natural. It was too perfectly square, too deliberate in its placement. I approached cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. The box had been covered with dirt and foliage, but it wasn't hard to see that it had been disturbed recently. The wood had been scratched, as though something had tried to claw its way out. My mind raced. Was someone living out here? Or had something been kept in this box, something that had escaped? I spent the next few minutes examining the box from every angle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I wasn't sure what I'd find inside, and part of me didn't want to know. I had the overwhelming urge to turn around and leave, but I knew I couldn't. I had to find out. After a moment of hesitation, I pulled back the leaves and cleared the rest of the dirt away. My hands shook as I lifted the lid of the box. Inside was an insect. No, not just one insect. Cluster. Thousands of them, writhing in the darkness of the box. But they weren't normal insects. They were too large, too unnatural. Their bodies were swollen, and their legs moved in erratic, jerky motions. The sight of them crawling over each other sent a shiver down my spine. They looked like something out of a nightmare, but they weren't just any insects. They were genetically altered. The realization hit me hard. These insects weren't just a part of the ecosystem. This was part of some twisted experiment. I had no idea who had done it or why, but I knew I had to report this. My research was supposed to be purely academic, but this was something else entirely. Something darker, something dangerous. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the box. I could feel the weight of the air, thick with the hum of insects in the woods. As I turned to leave, a faint sound broke the silence. The unmistakable sound of a branch snapping behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering. There was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I made my way back to the cabin, every step feeling like someone, asterisk or something asterisk, was watching me. I reached the cabin just before nightfall. The warmth of the place should have been comforting, but it only made the tension worse. The insects that I had collected were now crawling in their vials, their presence a constant reminder of what I had uncovered. That night, I could barely sleep. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin. Scratching sounds at the door, the faintest of footsteps outside. But each time I got up to check, there was nothing. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I tried to stick to my research, but every time I ventured into the woods, I felt eyes on me. The insects I discovered continued to thrive in their vials, their rapid movements a constant source of unease. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I had to report this. But then the real nightmare began. On the 8th day, I woke up to find the cabin door wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I had locked it securely before bed. Something or someone had been inside. The cabin was undisturbed, but the eerie feeling was suffocating. I grabbed my research notes and headed out of the cabin. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that I was being followed. My instincts told me to leave, but I needed to gather more evidence, more samples. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a desperate need to uncover the truth. no matter what it cost. By the time I returned to the clearing with the wooden box, the pile of dirt and leaves had been disturbed again. The box was no longer where I'd left it. It had been dragged into the center of the clearing. I froze, fear surging through me. Someone or something was out there. I could feel it. It wasn't just the insects anymore. It was the whole forest. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows stretching in unnatural ways. My thoughts were racing as I backed away from the clearing. It was time to leave. I had enough evidence. But as I turned to make my way back to the cabin, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I looked down in shock to see a long, dark sting on my calf, the skin already beginning to swell. I didn't have time to think. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I barely made it back to the cabin before I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The sting throbbed painfully, and I could feel the venom spreading through my body. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt completely and utterly helpless. I knew I had to leave the woods. Asterisk immediately star. But the insects, the altered insects, had already marked me. I could feel it, and whatever had been experimenting with them had noticed me too. The next morning, I was gone. It was late September when I first started working as a park ranger at Red Creek National Park. The air was crisp and dry, and the forest had already begun to show the first signs of autumn, with leaves turning shades of orange and yellow. I just turned 32 and had been assigned to manage the remote cabin located deep in the woods. It wasn't a high-traffic area, and most visitors didn't venture past the park's main trails, so I found myself alone most of the time. It wasn't that I minded. I'd always preferred solitude, and the cabin was tucked far enough from the main office that the peace of the forest felt like a blanket over me. The cabin itself was an old structure, probably about 30 years old, made of weathered wood that had turned almost gray from years of exposure. It had a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and the chimney was always a comforting presence when the wind picked up. I'd been tasked with maintenance, making sure the trails were clear, and keeping watch over the park's boundaries. I had been there for about 2 weeks when something started feeling off. It was a Thursday night, and I just finished my rounds, walking the perimeter and checking the trail signs. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, and the stars were so bright it felt like I could reach out and touch them. The air smelled like damp earth and wood, the kind of scent that fills your lungs and makes you feel grounded. The cabin was quiet when I got back, just the usual creaks and groans as the woods settled. I made myself a simple dinner, canned beans and some bread, and ate quickly, not feeling very hungry. Maybe it was the solitude, or maybe it was the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation that, no matter how far I walked into the woods, something was always just behind the trees, just out of sight. After I finished eating, I went out onto the porch to smoke a cigarette. The night was colder now, and the wind had picked up. It howled through the branches, making the trees sway like dark shadows against the sky. I just lit my cigarette when I noticed something strange. Footprints. At first, I thought maybe it was from an animal, but as I squinted in the dim light, I realized they were human footprints, or at least they looked like human footprints. The tracks were fresh, with the ground still disturbed. The dirt around them was soft from the recent rain, and they led straight to the cabin. I flicked my cigarette away and stood up. The tracks didn't look like they belonged to anyone from the park. No one else was supposed to be out here at this hour. I walked closer, crouching down to get a better look. They were barefoot, and I could see the subtle indentations in the earth from where the toes had pressed in. Whoever had left them hadn't made much of an effort to hide their presence. I looked around, my heart starting to beat a little faster. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't ignore the tracks. They didn't stop at the cabin. They curved around the side, where the shadows were thick. I knew I should probably call it in to the station, but part of me didn't want to admit I was worried. It was late, the air was cold, and I wasn't in the mood for another round of paperwork or phone calls. Instead, I decided to check it out myself. I grabbed my flashlight from the table by the door, made sure my radio was on, and stepped off the porch. The tracks led behind the cabin, where the forest was denser and the trees seemed to press in closer. It was quiet now, the wind having died down almost entirely. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional creak of a tree branch swaying in the distance. The tracks continued along a narrow path that I'd never noticed before. It wasn't a proper trail, more like an animal's trail, worn down by repeated use. I followed it for maybe 50 yards before I realized it was leading me deeper into the woods. I started to feel a tightness in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was around this point that I noticed something else. There were more tracks, but they were mixed with the first set. It was almost as if someone had walked with the first person, but their footprints were fainter, less distinct. I turned around, trying to shake the feeling of being followed, but the forest behind me was dark and still. I moved on, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the thick blackness. The ground started to slope downward, and the trees grew thicker, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. It was strange. I'd never gone this far before, but something about the landscape felt familiar, like it had been here long before I started working in the park. The tracks eventually led to a small clearing, and at the center there was a fire pit. The rocks surrounding it were blackened, the remnants of ash still scattered around the edges. And there, just past the fire pit, stood a figure. I froze. It wasn't a person, at least not in the sense I would have expected. It was a tall, thin shape partially hidden by the trees, but I could see enough to know it wasn't normal. The skin was pale, almost sickly, and the eyes, I can't really describe them. They were black, unblinking, and they seemed to reflect the dim light of my flashlight like glass. It stood motionless, watching me. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. My mouth was dry, my breath shallow. I had no idea what I was looking at, but the instinct to turn and run was overwhelming. I did. I turned and bolted through the woods, the sound of my boots slamming into the ground louder in my ears than the wind or the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I locked the door behind me as soon as I was inside. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't know how long I sat by the fire, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't a person, couldn't have been, but whatever it was real. I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I went back to the clearing. The tracks were gone. The fire pit was cold, and the trees stood just as still as they had the night before. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but I knew what I had seen. I never figured out who or what it was, but I didn't need to. The park was a big place, and I kept to my cabin for the rest of the season. No more late-night walks, no more straying too far from the cabin. I kept my distance from that area, and when the end of the season came, I left. I don't know if anyone else saw what I did that night, but I'll never forget it. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be out there. It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway, a simple retreat from the everyday noise, a chance to escape from the stress of work, the noise of the city, and the constant rush of life. I had rented a small cabin up in the northern woods, just outside a sleepy town called Blackwater. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, and most importantly, remote. I'd heard about this cabin from a coworker, Greg, who swore it was the perfect place for some solitude. So, I booked it and set off for a weekend of nothing but fresh air, a good book, and a much-needed break. I remember the drive there like it was yesterday. The road to Blackwater was long and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The car's engine hummed steadily as I made my way further into the woods, passing no other vehicles, just the occasional deer darting across the road. As I got closer, the GPS signal began to fade, and the roads became more rugged, less traveled. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the light, and the sky above seemed to grow heavier with every passing mile. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was exactly as described. An old wooden structure tucked away at the edge of a forest, surrounded by towering pine trees. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked a small clearing. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a painting, the kind of place that felt like it had been untouched for years. I unloaded my bags and took a deep breath. The air was fresh, crisp even, with that earthy scent that only the woods could provide. I stepped inside the cabin, the floor creaking beneath my feet. It was furnished simply, nothing fancy, but enough to feel comfortable. A small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a couple of old armchairs, and a bed in the corner. There was a stack of firewood beside the stove, and the windows were large, offering a perfect view of the forest. I was alone, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The first few hours were bliss. I made myself a simple dinner, sat in the armchair by the fire, and read a book. The world outside seemed so far away. I hadn't realized how much I needed this until I felt the weight of the city's stress slowly lift off my shoulders. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that accompanied me, and it was almost too quiet, but in a good way. Night fell quickly. The darkness outside was absolute, with only the faint glow of the stars above to guide me. I closed the blinds and settled into bed around 10 p.m., hoping for a deep, uninterrupted sleep. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but something else. A discomfort that I couldn't quite explain. It was as if the cabin itself was watching me, or perhaps the woods outside, but I brushed it off. It was probably just the silence. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake. The sound of something, footsteps, I thought, echoed from outside. I strained my ears, listening closely. There it was again, a soft crunching noise, like someone walking through the underbrush. I couldn't remember hearing any cars pull up, and I was certain I hadn't seen anyone on my drive-in. My heart rate picked up. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe a deer or a bear, wandering through the clearing. Still, the noise persisted, and with it, my unease grew. I didn't have any neighbors close by, at least none that I knew of. The cabin was isolated, almost too isolated. I sat up in bed, staring through the window at the dark expanse of the woods. The porch light was off, but the light from the moon filtered through the trees just enough to make out shapes. I didn't see anything. I tried to calm myself, but the sound was still there. The crunching, the movement like someone or something was walking just outside. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I've been reading a lot of thrillers lately. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Eventually, the noises stopped. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, heavier. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts running wild. The next morning, I woke to a dull, gray light filtering through the windows. I hadn't slept much, but I figured the best thing to do was to get up, make some coffee, and take a walk outside to clear my head. I needed to get back to that sense of calm that had brought me here in the first place. I stepped outside onto the porch, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The woods were quiet, as they should be, and the clearing in front of the cabin was empty. No signs of anything unusual. Still, my gut told me something was off. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, but nothing seemed out of place. No broken branches or disturbed dirt, just the same quiet woods. I decided I was just being paranoid. After breakfast, I took a walk through the woods behind the cabin. The trees towered above me, their trunks thick and dark. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, and I had to push through some thick brush to continue on. I had brought a small backpack with some water and snacks, thinking I might get a few hours of hiking in. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just my imagination. It was a tangible sense that something was wrong. I decided to head back to the cabin, feeling uneasy. As I emerged from the trees and back into the clearing, I froze. There, in the middle of the clearing, was something that hadn't been there before. A small, weathered bag. It was lying right in the middle of the path, as though it had been dropped there recently. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt down and opened the bag. Inside was a flashlight, a water bottle, and a few granola bars. Nothing too unusual, but the fact that it was just sitting there in the middle of nowhere made my skin crawl. I looked around, expecting someone to appear from the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. I quickly picked up the bag, stuffed it into my own backpack, and hurried back to the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been here recently? Who would leave a bag like that out in the middle of nowhere? As I reached the cabin, I noticed something else. The front door, which I had definitely closed before going on my walk, was now slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Someone had been inside. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. I stepped inside cautiously, checking each room, but everything seemed in its place. No signs of forced entry, no missing items. Yet, the sense of intrusion was undeniable. Someone had been in my cabin. I sat down on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. I had to leave. This place wasn't as safe as I thought. I grabbed my things, packed up quickly, and locked the door behind me. My mind raced as I started the car, preparing to drive back to the town. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught one last glimpse of the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw something or someone move in the window. My pulse quickened, but when I looked again, it was gone. The drive back to town was long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. When I got to Blackwater, I stopped at a small diner to grab a cup of coffee and calm my nerves. As I sat down at the counter, the waitress, a middle-aged woman with gray hair, looked at me with a knowing expression. She had to have seen the panic on my face. "Did you stay at the old McGregor cabin?" she asked casually, almost like she had asked this 100 times before. I nodded, my throat tight. She sighed. "Yeah, a lot of folks go there for peace and quiet, but it's not always as peaceful as they think. Strange things happen out there. People have gone missing before, you know?" I stared at her, my heart pounding once again. "What do you mean?" She just shook her head, her eyes sad. "Some cabins are best left alone. Trust me." I didn't ask any more questions. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. As I left the diner and drove back to my hotel, I felt a strange sense of relief. The town was busy, the streets were crowded, and the noise felt comforting, normal. The woods and the cabin were behind me, and that was exactly where I wanted them to stay. I never went back to the McGregor cabin. I never found out who left that bag in the woods, or who had been inside my cabin. And honestly, I didn't want to. Some things I think are better left unexplained.